The valley knew I was coming before it saw my face. I felt it from the ridge as the light went out of the day, the dread moving down through Ashfell like water finding low ground, door to door, hearth to hearth. A shepherd on the far slope caught my shape against the failing sky, dropped his crook, and ran without gathering his flock. I did not blame him. 7 years is long enough to turn a man into a story, and the story they told of me was not a kind one. I sat my horse a while and looked down at the hold I had been born to. The Carrow River still bent its bright elbow around the mill, the way it had every autumn of my boyhood. The pines still climbed the eastern ridge in their dark ranks. Smoke still rose from the longhouse in the center of the hold where the pack ate its evening meal, and from the smaller roofs scattered down toward the water. It was all exactly as I had left it, and none of it was mine any more. I had ridden a very long way to feel like a stranger at my own gate. Below me a bell began to ring. Not the harvest bell, not the moon bell, the low, ugly clang they rang when a threat came to the wall. They were ringing it for me. I heard shouts carry up the cold air, men calling other men from their suppers, the particular clatter of spears being taken down. I had expected it. I had, if I am honest, half wanted it, some clean confrontation to burn off the 7 years of silence in me. But my wolf, which had been a hard, quiet thing for a long time, stirred at the ringing of that bell and turned its head toward the mill by the river, and would not look away. The mill, of course the mill. I nudged the horse down off the ridge and let them see me come. They met me at the eastern gate with torches and a wall of spears, and behind the spears, faces I had grown up beside, older now, harder, afraid. I knew every one of them. Old Doran the smith, gone white at the temples. The 3 Aldish brothers who had been boys chasing me through the barley and now stood shoulder to shoulder with their points leveled at my chest. And in the center, under the gate lantern, wearing a cloak I recognized because it had been my father's, stood my cousin Boris. He had grown into the seat. That was the first thing I saw. 7 years ago Boris had been a lean, watchful young man who stood at the edges of the hall and said little. Now he filled the doorway of the gate like he owned the stone. He wore the Alpha's mantle, the gray wolf pelt clasped at the throat with the iron pin that had passed down my line for 200 years, and he wore it easily, the way a man wears a thing he has stopped questioning his right to. Torin, he said. Not cousin, not my lord, just the name flat testing the weight of me. Boris, I answered and did not dismount. Ears wavered. I watched the men behind them try to reconcile the thing on the horse with the boy they remembered. I had left Ashfell at 23, tall but soft-handed still, an heir who had never had to be anything but loved. What came back was leaner and grayer and carried the war in its shoulders. There is a way a man holds himself after he has stood in a shield wall enough times, a stillness that other men read and stepped back from without knowing why. I had it now. I had paid a great deal for it. You have a great deal of nerve, Boris said, riding to my gate. My gate, I let that pass. I have come home, I said. A ripple went through them at that word. Old Doran made a small sound, half a laugh and half a groan, and looked away from me into the dark. And Boris smiled, a slow, careful smile that did not reach his eyes. Home, he repeated, tasting it. You have no home here. You gave it up. You ran in the night like a whipped dog and left this hold to face the Harrowmen with no heir and no. Where is she? I had not meant to say it. 7 years I had rehearsed this return, and in none of the rehearsals did I lead with those 3 words, before the truth, before the reckoning, before anything. But my wolf had turned its head toward the river the moment I crossed the wall's line, and the question came out of me the way blood comes out of a wound, before you have decided to bleed. Boris went still. Where is who? He said, but he knew. I saw him know. Nessa Aldine, I said, the miller's daughter. For a moment no one spoke. The torches hissed. Somewhere down toward the water a dog was barking itself hoarse, and I watched something move across the faces in front of me, not fear now, but a kind of shame, a wince, men glancing at each other and then at the ground. The Aldish brothers lowered their spears an inch without meaning to. Doran the smith put his hand over his mouth. And Boris laughed. That, he said, that is why you came back, after 7 years. He shook his head slowly, and the laugh in his throat was worse than any curse. You truly do not know. Know what? You'll see her soon enough, Boris said. You'll find she's exactly where you left her. She never had the sense to be anywhere else. I dismounted. I did it slowly, because I had learned that slowness frightens men more than speed, and I wanted them frightened enough to let me pass. I handed the reins to the nearest of the Aldish brothers, young Wick, who took them from me out of pure childhood habit and then looked horrified at himself, and I walked toward the gate, and the spears came up again, and Boris lifted one hand. Let him through, he said. Let him see. Let him understand what his running cost before I decide what to do with him. His eyes found mine, and there was real hatred in them, old and well-fed. Go on, cousin. Go to your miller's girl. Go and see the wreck you made of her. They opened for me, not out of respect, out of the thing men feel when they are about to watch someone walk into their own grief and do not want to be the ones to stop it. I walked down through Ashfell toward the river, and my hold watched me from its windows, and I did not look at any of them. My wolf was pulling me by the breastbone now, straight as a plumb line, toward the sound of the wheel. You should understand how I left, or none of the rest will make sense. And you should understand it now, before you see her, because I have found that the truth of a thing lands hardest when you know its price beforehand. 7 years ago, the Harrowmen came down out of the north. They were not raiders. Raiders you fight and bury and forget. The Harrowmen were a coalition, 3 packs bound under one warlord, a cold and patient man named Sarn Voss, and they did not want our cattle or our grain. They wanted the Carrow Vale itself, the river and the mill and the pass, because whoever held the pass held the trade road to the coast. My father was old by then and failing. The pack was strong but small, and Sarn Voss had 400 spears and the winter on his side. He made my father an offer. It was not truly an offer. He would take the hold in the spring and put every wolf in it to the sword, or my father would give him a hostage, not a ransom of gold, a hostage of service. An heir of Ashfell blood, bound to Voss for 7 years, to fight his wars and hold his line and prove that the Carrow Vale had submitted. 7 years, and then the debt was paid and the hold left in peace. That was the price of Ashfell's survival. One of us, gone into the dark, to be used up in another man's battles. My father could not send himself. He would not have lived the journey, and there was only one heir. I did not tell them. That was my choice, and I have had 7 years to decide whether it was the right one, and I still do not know. If I had stood in the hall and announced that I was giving myself to Sarn Voss to spare them, the pack would have refused. They would have chosen to fight and die rather than send their heir into bondage. Pride is a mountain in a wolf pack, and it does not bend. My father knew it too, so we agreed, he and I, in the dark of his sick room, that I would simply go, in the night. Without a word. Let them think what they wished. Let them think me a coward if it kept them from throwing themselves onto Voss's spears out of loyalty to a man who had chosen to save them. So on a night in the first frost, I saddled a horse and rode north to give myself to my enemy, and I told no one. No one but her. I could not leave without telling her. That was the one thing I would not do. Nessa Aldine and I had grown up along the same river, she at the mill, I at the longhouse, and somewhere in the years between childhood and that frost, the bond had started to wake between us. You know the way of it. A day comes when the girl you have known your whole life turns her head a certain way in a certain light, and your wolf lifts its head inside you and says, "There, that one, that is the one," and the whole shape of your life reorders itself around a truth you did not choose. We had never claimed it. We were young, and I was the heir. And there were counsels and cautions and 100 reasons to wait, but we both knew. On the night I left, I went to the mill first. I remember she was still awake, mending by the last of the fire, and she looked up when I came in from the cold, and she knew at once from my face that something had broken. I told her everything. The Harrowmen, the bargain, the 7 years, the reason I could not tell the pack. I told her I did not know if I would live to come back. and I asked her the only thing I had any right to ask, which was that she remember I had not run. "Whatever they say of me," I said, "whatever name they put on it, you know the truth, that's enough. That has to be enough." And I can still see her face by that dying fire. She did not weep and she did not beg me to stay. She took my hand in both of hers, which were rough from the millstones and warm the way stone is warm when it has sat all day in the sun, and she said, "Then I'll keep the wheel turning until you're back. However long. You'll know Asheville still stands because the mill's still grinding, and you'll know I'm still here because the door's still lit." That was the last I saw of her. I did not claim the bond. I would not chain her to a man who might not return. I would not have her be a widow to a marriage that never was. I left her free. I told myself it was mercy. I rode north and I gave myself to Sarn Voss, and I did not tell her because I did not know that leaving her free would cost her everything. The mill came up out of the dark, and the wheel was turning. I stopped at the edge of the yard where the river light glinted, and I stood and listened to it, the great slow groan of the wheel, the rush and slap of the water on the paddles, the deep grinding hum of the stones inside. It was the first sound of my childhood. It was the sound I had held in my head through 7 winters of war, through the shield walls and the burning holds and the nights I was so certain I would die that I made my peace with the cold. The wheel's still turning. Asheville still stands. She's still there. I had made a religion of that sound in the worst places a man can be, and here it was, real, turning in the dark in front of me, and my knees very nearly went. There was a light in the mill window. The door was lit. I crossed the yard. I had my hand raised to the door when it opened, and she was standing there. 7 years. I want to tell you she was unchanged, that she was exactly the girl I left by the fire, but that would be a lie and she deserves better than lies. She was older. There was gray at her temple, too early for it, the kind of gray that grief puts there. She was thinner than I remembered, and there were lines at the corners of her eyes that had not been there, and her hands, she had a lamp raised in one hand. Her hands were a working woman's hands, cracked at the knuckle, strong. She had been carrying a mill alone. I could see the whole of it in one look, 7 years of carrying a mill alone. But her eyes were the same. That is the thing that undid me. Her eyes found my face in the lamplight, and they were exactly, precisely the same, and they filled not with fear, the way every other pair of eyes in Asheville had filled that night. They filled with something I had stopped letting myself hope for on about the 3rd year, somewhere in the mud of a war that was not mine. "Torin," she said. 2 syllables. My name the old way, the way only she had ever said it, soft on the first and falling on the second. I have stood in shield walls. I have watched men die at arm's length and kept my feet. I have crossed a frozen river in the dark with a spear wound in my side, biting down on my own belt so I would not cry out and give away the crossing. I had made myself, over 7 years, into a thing that did not break, because breaking meant dying, and I had promised the miller's daughter I would come back. And she said my name in the mill doorway, and every wall I had built came down at once, all 7 years of them, all at the same time, so fast it hurt. My wolf, which I had thought had gone hard and cold and half dead in me, rose up in my chest with a force that put me half a step forward before I knew I had moved, and I understood, standing there, that it had never left this valley at all. It had only been waiting, curled at her door, keeping the wheel turning in the one part of me the war could not reach. The lamp shook in her hand. "You came back," she said, and her voice broke on back. "You came back." I said I would. They said, her mouth worked. 7 years of things they had said were behind it. They've said so many things, Torin, for so long, that you were dead, that you were a coward, that you'd taken up with Voss and turned your coat and were living fat in the north while she stopped. She pressed her lips together and steadied the lamp with her other hand, deliberately, the way you steady a thing when you have learned that no one will steady it for you. I stopped listening to what they said. A long time ago. I only ever listened to what you told me by the fire. You said you hadn't run, so I knew you hadn't run. Nessa, I could barely get the word out. What did they do to you? And there it was, the thing Baris had smiled about, the thing the men at the gate could not look at. It crossed her face like a shadow crossing water. She looked down at the lamp and then back up at me, and she made herself say it plainly, because she is, and always will be a woman who says the hard thing plainly. They made me carry it, she said. The shame. When you vanished and no one knew why, they needed someone to hold it, and everyone knew you'd loved me, and I was only the miller's daughter, so. She lifted one shoulder, a small, terrible gesture. It was easy. The coward's leavings, that's what they took to calling me. The girl the runaway heir couldn't even be bothered to take with him. Baris made sure of it. He took your father's seat within the year. Your father didn't last the winter after you left. Torin, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry to be the one to. She stopped again, gathered herself, went on. Baris took the seat, and he needed the pack to hate you so they wouldn't ask why he was so quick to sit down in your chair. So he made you a coward, and he made me the fool who waited for a coward. 7 years, I said. My voice did not sound like mine. 7 years, she agreed. No one would match with me. No family would tie itself to your shame. I kept the mill because it was mine by my father's line, and there was nothing they could do about that, but they made a lesson of me. Mothers point me out to their daughters. That's what waiting for a faithless man buys you. A crooked, exhausted smile. I ground their grain and mended their nets and delivered their bobbies when the birthing went wrong, because I'm the only one in the valley who learned the healing, and they took the bread and the mending and the living children from my hands and still called me the coward's leavings on the way out the door. Every year, for 7 years. She had said it all without weeping. That was the worst of it. She had said the whole 7 years of it in the flat, steady voice of someone who has told the truth of her own suffering to herself so many times, in the dark, that it has worn smooth and stopped cutting. And I stood in her doorway, and I thought of the vow I had made and kept, of the shield walls I had held for a warlord's cause I did not believe in, telling myself the whole time that I was buying peace for these people. And I understood that while I bled to keep them safe, they had taken the woman I loved and made her into their shame, and she had let them, because to defend herself she would have had to tell them the truth I had sworn her to keep. She had kept my secret for 7 years, at the cost of her whole standing in the world, because I asked her to. I went down on one knee in the millyard mud. I did not decide to. It simply seemed the only honest place to be. Torin, she stepped forward, alarmed. Get up, what are you? You kept my secret, I said. You let them do that to you for 7 years, and you never told them the truth because I asked you not to. You made me swear, she said quietly. The night by the fire. You said the pack would throw themselves on Voss's spears if they knew. You said keeping it quiet was the only way to keep them alive. I believed you, Torin. I still believe you. Was I wrong to? No, the word came out of me raw. No, you were right. You were the only one in this whole valley who was right about anything for 7 years. And then she did weep, not for herself, I think, but at being told, finally, out loud, by the one person whose word she'd been living on, that she had been right all along. She set the lamp down on the doorstone very carefully so she would not drop it, and she came down into the mud with me. And I took her hands, those strong, cracked, mill-worn hands, and I pressed them to my face, and I breathed her in. Wet stone and ground grain and wood smoke, the smell of the whole rest of my life. And my wolf, that hard old survivor, that thing I had thought the war had killed, settled at last all the way down home. You smell like the mill, I said, muffled, stupid, into her hands. She made a sound that was half a sob and half a laugh. You smell like a battlefield, she said. You smell like blood and horse and cold. What did they do to you, Torin Vale? 7 years. What did they make you into? I'll tell you all of it, I said. Every night of it if you want it, but not tonight. I lifted my head and looked at her close in the lamplight, and the bond that we had never claimed, that I had left unclaimed to keep her free, sat between us in the cold air like a live coal that 7 years of ash had never once put out. Tonight I only need one thing from you, And then tomorrow I'm going to stand in that hall and put the whole truth in front of the pack that shamed you, and Boris can do what he likes about it." "What thing?" she whispered. "I left you free," I said. "7 years ago, I wouldn't claim the bond because I wouldn't chain you to a dead man's memory. I told myself it was a kindness." I laughed, and it was a terrible laugh because I finally understood the joke of it. "Nessa, leaving you free is what let them do this to you. If I'd claimed you, you'd have been the alpha's own mate, and not even Boris could have made you into a shame. My kindness is the thing that broke your life. Do you understand? The one thing I did to protect you is the exact thing that hurt you." She was very still. The wheel groaned behind us. "I'm not asking you now to make it right for you," I said. "It's late for that, and I know it. I'm asking because I have wanted it every single day for 7 years, and I nearly died 100 times without ever having said it aloud, and I will not go into that hall tomorrow with it still unsaid." I held her hands tighter. "Nessa Aldine, you are my fated mate. You have been since the barley fields when we were children, and I was too much of a fool to know it. I don't want you free anymore. Free hasn't done either of us a particle of good. I want you mine, and I want to be yours, out loud, in front of God and the pack and every matron who ever called you a fool for waiting. If you'll have a man who's been gone 7 years and come back a stranger with blood on him. If there's anything left in you that isn't worn out from carrying my name like a stone." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she took her hands out of mine, and my heart dropped clean through the millyard into the river, and she put them on either side of my face, war-stubbled and cold, and she held it the way you hold something you are afraid will vanish, and she said, "You great, kind, stupid man, I never once wanted to be free." And the bond at last, after 7 years, ignited between us, not with fire, not with any grand thing the old songs promise, but with a warmth that went down the center of me like the sun coming back after a long north winter, and I felt her at the other end of it, her fear and her exhaustion and her stubborn, unkillable steadiness, all of it flooding into me at once, and I felt myself go into her the same way, and for the first time in 7 years I was not carrying it alone. And neither was she. We stayed there in the mud a long time, the two of us holding on. The wheel turned. The door stayed lit. I did not claim her that night in any way the songs would sing about. I am telling you honestly. I held her, and she held me, and at some point she took me inside out of the cold and put me by the mill fire, the same fire I had left her at 7 years before, and wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and put bread and broth in my hands as though I were one more soul in the valley she was keeping alive. And she watched me eat with her chin on her knees and would not stop looking at me, as if I might be a thing she'd dreamed. "Tomorrow," she said once into the quiet. "Tomorrow," I agreed. "Boris won't give it up easily, the seat. He's had 7 years to grow into it." "I don't want the seat," I said, and found as I said it that it was true. "I never came back for the seat, Nessa. Let Boris keep his chair. I came back for you and to lift what he put on you. That's all I want out of this valley. You and your name made clean. The rest he can have." She was quiet a moment. "You may not get to choose that," she said. "The pack chooses its alpha, and when they hear the truth, what you did, why you left, some of them are going to want you back in that chair whether you want it or not. And Boris knows it. That's why he'll fight. Not for hate of you, for fear of the truth." Her eyes came up to mine, tired and clear. "He didn't just steal your seat, Torin. He built it on a lie about you, and he stacked 7 years on top of that lie, and he stacked me on top of it as the mortar. If the truth comes out, the whole thing comes down. He'll do a great deal to keep it standing." I looked at her over the fire, this woman who had ground grain and healed children and been called a fool for loving me, and who now, an hour into having me back, was already thinking 3 moves ahead of the man who had ruined her, on my behalf. "You should have been the alpha," I said. "You'd have run this valley better than any of us." She almost smiled. "Get some sleep, my lord," she said. "You've a hall to walk into in the morning." I did not sleep much. I sat up by the fire while she slept in the loft above, and I listened to the wheel turn, and I thought about 7 years, and I made my plans. Here is what I knew that Boris did not know I knew. When Sarn Voss took me north, he took a proof with him. He was a cold man but a careful one, and a hostage bargain is only worth anything if it can be shown. Before I left, in the sick room, my father had pressed a thing into my hand, a token. Half of the old iron marriage seal of our line, the twin of the piece Boris now wore at his throat as the Alpha's pin. My father had broken the ancient seal in two with his own failing hands. One half to go north with me as the physical proof of the bargain, held by Voss's own record keepers, marked and dated and witnessed by 3 packs, and the other half, the pin, to stay in Ashfell as the mark of the seat. My father had done this deliberately. So that one day, he had whispered, "When your 7 years are done and you come home, you can lay the 2 halves together in front of them all, and no man alive can call you a coward, because the iron itself will testify." He had thought of everything, my father, dying in the dark. He had known they would call me a coward. He had built into the very seal of our house the means to prove them wrong. I had carried my half for 7 years, through every battle, sewn into the lining over my heart. It was the second religion I made, after the sound of the wheel, that iron half-moon of my father's foresight, waiting for the morning I could bring it home and lay it down. And Boris wore the other half at his throat, as the mark of a seat he had built on the lie that I had thrown mine away. He did not know the halves fit. He wore the pin as a spoil. He had no idea that the very iron on his own collar would, laid beside its twin, prove in front of the whole pack that I had gone north under a sworn bargain and not run, that the seal of Ashfell had been broken on purpose to make this exact reckoning possible. I sat by the fire and turned my half of the seal over in my fingers, and I thought, "Father, you clever old wolf, you've been waiting for tomorrow as long as I have." They gathered the pack in the longhouse at midday, because Boris wanted an audience. That was his mistake, though he did not know it yet. He wanted the pack to see the feared exile brought low, to watch him pronounce judgment on the coward who dared come back, to cement his own seat by standing over me in front of every wolf in Ashfell. He had a whole speech, I think. He had probably had it ready for 7 years. I came into the hall with Nessa at my side. That, too, was deliberate. I could have come alone, come humble, come as a supplicant. Instead, I walked the length of my father's hall with the miller's daughter beside me, her hand in mine, and I watched the pack understand what it meant. The matrons who had spent 7 years pointing her out as a warning went still and would not meet her eyes. The men who had lowered their spears at the gate looked at our joined hands and then at the floor. And Boris, in the Alpha's seat in my father's mantle, saw us come, and I watched the careful smile die on his face, because a coward's shamed leavings do not walk into the hall of the pack holding the coward's hand like a queen. "You dare," Boris began, rising. "You dare bring her in here, you dare." "I dare a great deal," I said, and my voice, 7 years deeper than the one they remembered, carried the length of the hall and stopped him. "Sit down, cousin. You wanted the pack gathered. Good. So do I. There's a thing they've been owed for 7 years, and I mean to pay it." "There is nothing owed," Boris said, "except by you. You ran. You left this hold defenseless before the Harrowmen. You broke your father's heart and put him in his grave, and you have the—" "The Harrowmen never took the Carrow Vale," I said. "Did they?" "Silence." "Sarn Voss came down out of the north with 400 spears," I said, turning now not to Boris but to the pack, to the faces I had grown up beside. "Every one of you remembers that autumn. You remember the fear of it. 400 spears and the winter coming, and Ashfell with maybe 80 fighting wolves and an Alpha too sick to sit his horse. You all lay awake that autumn waiting to die." I looked from face to face. "And then, in the spring, Voss turned north again and never came back. And you told yourselves you'd been lucky. You told yourselves the winter had turned him. You've told yourselves a comfortable story for 7 years about why the Harrowmen who were going to burn this valley to the waterline simply went away." Old Doran the smith had gone very white. "They went away," I said, "because they were paid." With what? Someone called out, young Wick at the back, who had taken my reins at the gate. We had no gold. We had nothing. Not gold, I said. A hostage. A wolf of Ashfell blood given into Voss's service for 7 years to fight his wars, to hold his line, to be used up in his battles as the price of this valley's peace. That was Voss's offer. A life. One of ours gone north into the dark for 7 years and the Carrow Vale left untouched. I let it sit. There was only one heir. And the pack would never have allowed the heir to go. You'd have thrown yourselves onto Voss's spears out of pride first, and died for it, every one of you and your children with you. So it was done quietly, in the night, without a word, so that you'd all live to stand in this hall and call him a coward. The hall had gone so still, I could hear the fire. You're lying, Boris said, but his voice had thinned. You have no proof, you have a story. Any deserter can dress his running up in. I reached into the lining of my coat, over my heart, and I drew out the iron. I held it up so the whole hall could see it. The broken half-moon of the old seal of Ashfell, black iron worn smooth by 7 years against my chest, its broken edge jagged and bright. My father broke the seal of our house in 2 with his own hands, I said, the night before I went north. Half went with me to Voss's own record keepers, marked and witnessed by 3 packs as the proof of the bargain. It sits in the north still in Voss's hall, and any wolf here who doubts me may ride and read it. And half stayed in Ashfell. I turned slowly and I looked at Boris, and I looked at the iron pin gleaming at his throat, holding my father's mantle closed. He stayed. As the mark of the seat. So that on the day the 7 years were paid and the hostage came home, the 2 halves could be laid together in front of the whole pack, and no wolf living could call it running, because the iron itself would testify. Boris's hand went to his throat. You've been wearing the proof of my innocence for 7 years, cousin, I said quietly. You wore it as a spoil. You never knew the halves fit. This is, Boris was on his feet now, backing toward the seat. This proves nothing. A broken pin, any smith could. Doran, I said, you made the old seal, your father before you and his before him, 200 years. You know the break of it. You know the mark on the inner face that no smith outside your line has ever been able to copy. I held out my half across the hall. Come and look. Tell the pack I'm lying if I am. I'll walk out of this valley on your word and never come back. Come and look at the iron, Doran. The old smith came. The hall let him through in absolute silence. He took my half of the seal in his big scarred hands and turned it to the light, and he looked at the inner face, at the mark, and his hands began to shake. And then he crossed the hall to Boris, and Boris flinched back, and Doran said, low and terrible, "Give it here, Boris. I am your alpha." "Give me the pin," Doran said, "or I'll take it." And something in the old smith's voice made Boris fumble it off the mantle and drop it into his palm rather than be touched. Doran laid the 2 halves of iron together in the middle of the hall, where every wolf could see. They fit. Of course they fit. They had been one seal, broken on purpose by a dying alpha who loved his son and his people enough to make sure that one day, in this hall, the truth would have a body no man could argue with. The break married up jagged edge to jagged edge. The mark on the inner face ran unbroken across the seam, and Doran the smith stood over the joined iron and wept, openly, in front of the whole pack, the way a man weeps when a grief he has carried for 7 years is suddenly, unbearably, lifted. "He didn't run," Doran said to the hall, to all of them. "God forgive us, he didn't run. The boy went north to save us, and we called him a coward for 7 years. And the pack made a sound, a low, awful, collective sound, the sound of a whole people realizing at once what they have done. I let it break over them. I had earned the right to, and I took it. And then I turned to the true reckoning, the only one I had actually come home for. There's one more thing the iron proves, I said into the shamed quiet. It proves I was never faithless, and if I was never faithless, then the woman who waited for me was never a fool. I reached out my hand, and Nessa took it, and I drew her forward into the center of the hall beside the joined iron. For 7 years you called her the coward's leavings. You made a lesson of her. You took the bread from her mill and the healing from her hands and the living children she pulled out of your wives, and you called her a fool on the way out her door every year for waiting on a man you decided was worthless. My voice was very quiet now, and the hall strained to hear it, and that is the way to say a thing that matters. She kept my secret. That's why she couldn't defend herself. She knew the whole truth, the bargain, the reason from the night I left. She could have stopped her own shame at any moment in 7 years by simply telling you. And she never did, because I asked her not to keep you alive. She carried the shame that should have been your gratitude so that your pride wouldn't get you all killed. Every day one of you sneered at the miller's girl, you were sneering at the one wolf in this valley who was quietly saving your lives by keeping her mouth shut. I looked at the matrons who had pointed her out. I looked at them until they looked at the floor. She is not the coward's leavings, I said. There was never a coward, and she was never leavings. She is Nessa Aldine of the Caro Mill, and she is my fated mate, and she has been since we were children, and I was too much of a fool to claim her before I went, which is the true reason her life was left open for you to ruin. That's on me, not on her, never on her. I turned to her there in the center of my father's hall, and I did what I should have done 7 years before by the fire. I unclasped the war cloak from my own shoulders, the gray campaign cloak I had worn through 7 years of Sarn Voss's battles, and I put it around hers, and I closed it at her throat with the two joined halves of the seal of Ashfell married back into one. In front of all of you, I said to her, and only to her though the whole hall heard it. The way I should have, Nessa, be my Luna, not to lift you, you were never low. To stand where you always belonged, and let this whole valley see it, and let them carry the shame of it now instead of you. She looked up at me from inside my old cloak, and her eyes were wet and steady in hers. You took your time, Torrin Vale, she said. 7 years, I agreed. About 7 years too long, she said, and she was almost smiling, and then she wasn't because I had my arms around her. And the pack that had shamed her for 7 years watched their alpha's true heir hold the miller's daughter in the center of the hall, and not one of them made a sound, unless it was to weep. Barris ran, of course. There was no dramatic end to him, no duel in the hall, no reckoning under the moon. When the iron married up and Doran wept and the pack turned its face away from him, the thing Barris had built on my lie simply came down, all at once, the way Nessa had said it would, and he saw it coming down and he did not stay to be buried under it. Sometime in the confusion he slipped out a side door, and by the time anyone thought to look, he had taken a horse and gone. North, they said. He would find no welcome from Sarn Voss, who had no use for a wolf who couldn't hold his own seat. I did not send men after him. He was going to spend the rest of his life being no one in some other valley, wearing no mantle, holding no pin, and that seemed to me a heavier judgment than any I could hand down. Nessa agreed. Let him go and be small somewhere, she said. It's the one thing he was always afraid of. Let it be his whole life now. The pack asked me to take the seat. I want to be honest that I did not want it. I had told Nessa the truth by the fire. I had come home for her, and to make her name clean and not for my father's chair. But the pack asked, and Doran asked, and even the matrons who had shamed her asked, in the halting, shamed way of people trying to begin to make a thing right. And Nessa, in the end, was the one who told me to take it. They owe you, she said, in the loft above the mill the night after the hall. And they owe me, though they'll spend years learning how to pay it. If you take the seat, then the woman they shamed sits at the head of the valley that shamed her every day, where they have to look at her and remember. Not to punish them, she added before I could say anything. I'm too tired to punish anyone, but so they remember. So the next girl they're tempted to make a lesson of, they think twice. That's worth taking a chair for Torrin. That I'll be your Luna for. So I took the seat for that and for her. I did not take my father's mantle. It had been Barris's too long, and it had come to smell of the lie to me. I had Doran make a new clasp, he wanted to badly. He needed to make me something with his hands, that old smith, to work off 7 years of grief, and I wore a new cloak, and at its throat I wore the seal of Ashfell, both halves married into one, the brake line still visible if you knew to look for it. I have never had it smoothed over. I want the seam to show. I want every wolf who sees it to remember that this house was broken in two on purpose by a father who loved his son, so that a truth could be proven 7 years later. I want the seam to testify, the way my father meant it to. That was 4 years ago now. The wheel still turns at the Caro mill. Nessa would not give it up. It's my father's line and my own hands built it standing back from nothing, she said. I'm not handing it to a steward because I married the Alpha. So our Luna grinds grain some mornings still, with flour in her early gray hair, and the same matrons who called her the coward's leavings bring their grain to her mill and take their bread from her hands and thank her now, carefully, every time. She heals their children still. She is the first face a birthing woman in this valley wants to see. She has become, in 4 years, the most loved soul in the Caro Vale, and she carries it exactly the way she carried the shame, steadily, without fuss, one day at a time, keeping the wheel turning and the door lit. I told her once that I was sorry it took 7 years and a war to give her what she should have had from the start. She was mending by the fire when I said it, the same fire, the same mending, the same tilt of her head that had reordered my whole life in a barley field when we were children. She put the mending down. Torin, she said, I never once needed you to give me anything. I needed you to come back and tell them I was right. She reached over and took my hand in both of hers, those strong, cracked, unkillable hands, warm the way stone is warm when it has sat all day in the sun. You did that, in the hall, in front of all of them. You laid the iron down and you said there was never a coward and she was never a fool. That's all I waited 7 years for, not the seat, not the cloak. Just for the man I always knew you were to walk back into that hall and be him, out loud, where they had to hear it. I turned her hands over in mine and I thought about the shield walls and the frozen river and the 7 years I had made a religion out of the sound of a wheel, telling myself the whole time that I was doing it to keep these people safe, and how the truth, the deepest truth, was simpler than that and had been standing in a lit doorway the whole time. I'd do it again, I said, the 7 years, all of it, if it brought me back to this fire. I know you would, you great stupid man, she said, and picked her mending back up. That's rather the trouble with you. Outside in the dark, the wheel groaned and turned, grinding the valley's grain the way it had every autumn of my life, the way it had through all 7 years I was gone, kept turning by one stubborn pair of hands, so that a man in a war 100 leagues north would know, whenever the sound of it rose up in his memory, that Ashfell still stood and his door was still lit, and someone who knew the truth of him was still, against all sense and all the world, waiting. The door is still lit, it always was. That was the whole of it in the end. Not the iron, not the hall, not the seat. Just a door she kept lit for 7 years, and a man who finally walked through it and was home.